The house was dark long before I opened the door. Not the kind of dark that comes from a blown bulb or a late hour, but the kind that settles when something in a home has already died. The porch light flickered once like it was warning me, then steadied into a dull amber glow that did nothing to warm the air around it. I stood there for a moment, letting the cold bite through my jacket, listening to the wind drag itself across the siding. The yard was quiet, too quiet for a place that once carried the sound of my little girl's laughter spilling off the swing set. Even the street behind me felt hollow, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. When I reached for the handle, my hand paused an inch above the metal. It was warm. Someone had touched it not long before I arrived. Someone who should not have been here at this hour. Someone who had grown comfortable enough to leave traces of their warmth on my door. I pushed it open slow enough to hear every shift in the frame. Inside, the dark wasn't empty. It was watching, waiting. The kind of silence a man learns to read after too many nights overseas, when danger hides in ordinary shapes and ordinary rooms. The air carried a scent I didn't recognize. Sharp, confident. A scent that didn't belong to my life, my marriage, or the history of this house. Something moved deeper inside. A soft sound, barely a breath, but enough to tilt the balance of the room. The keys slipped from my fingers. The first thing I heard was the quiet clatter of my own keys hitting the hardwood floor. They slipped from my fingers when I opened the door. That had never happened to me before, not after deployments, not after midnight shifts, not after long drives through snowstorms. But that night, the weight of the house I thought I knew pressed on me the moment I stepped inside. The furnace was running steady but slightly off beat, as if someone had tried to reset the system without understanding its rhythm. I built that rhythm myself 2 winters ago, when the old unit died during a cold snap. I knew every sound it made, and I knew this one did not belong to me. Warm air brushed past my boots. A faint smell of sandalwood floated through the living room. Clean, sharp, a scent that had no history in my home. I set my duffel bag down. The lock clicked softly behind me. 7 weeks away at a training base in Texas. 7 weeks counting the days until I could step back into my own life. In every version of this moment I pictured Laura rushing toward me, brushing my hair back, saying she missed me. Instead, I heard utensils shift in the kitchen. Calm, unhurried, like someone finishing a meal that had nothing to do with me. Laura appeared in the doorway. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and gave me the kind of smile you offer to a neighbor dropping by unannounced. Polite, controlled, practiced. She said, "Welcome back." No warmth under the words, no relief in her eyes. They flicked toward me like she was checking off an item on a list. I studied her face, looking for something familiar, a spark, a memory. But all I found was distance. I stepped into the kitchen. The light was warm, but the air felt oddly vacant. On the table sat a glass I had never seen before. Modern crystal, narrow stem, a faint ring of sandalwood clinging to the rim. I leaned slightly toward it. The scent was unmistakable. Laura noticed my glance and said a co-worker had stopped by earlier. The explanation landed too neatly, too fast. People who tell the truth usually take a second to remember it. I nodded, not because I believed her, but because silence is the one thing that never reveals your hand too soon. Our daughter padded down the hallway. She held her tablet tight against her chest, fingers wrapped around the edges like she was guarding something private. She slowed when she reached me. Usually she ran, usually she laughed. Tonight she watched my face like she was searching for a signal she had forgotten how to read. I crouched down and brushed a hand over her hair. She leaned into me, but only slightly, the way a child leans into a stranger who happens to look familiar. When I asked about school, she glanced at Laura before answering. That small hesitation sliced deeper than anything else in the room. I stood up and looked around. The house was spotless, unnaturally so. The fruit bowl arranged perfectly, the rug vacuumed in straight lines, even the magnets on the fridge were aligned. Laura never cared about perfect order. She cared about us, and homes with real love in them always have a little chaos somewhere. Tonight there was none. I picked up my keys from the floor. They felt heavier than before. My fingertips brushed against the drywall near the staircase. I noticed a faint scuff mark at shoulder height. A mark from someone taller than me. Someone who had brushed past that wall recently, someone comfortable enough to leave a trace. Laura turned back into the kitchen. The light caught her profile. There was a softness around her mouth I had not seen in a long time. Not the softness she used to give me, a different one. One that did not belong to the life we built. My throat tightened, but not with anger, with understanding. I started up the stairs. The house creaked under my weight. Halfway up, I paused at the glass panel beside the banister. Laura stood at the bottom, leaning against the door frame, arms crossed. In the reflection, she looked smaller, distant, as if she was already living in a life that did not include me. Her reflection blinked. Mine did not. I walked into the bedroom. The sheets had been changed. Fresh detergent lingered in the air. The pillows were arranged differently, more carefully, as though someone had been sleeping on one side of the bed and wanted to hide the shape. I opened the drawer where I kept my watch. Inside, the contents were neat but off by an inch or two. Someone had moved things, then tried to put them back the way they thought they should be. Order without memory. Precision without authenticity. I sat on the bed and exhaled slowly. The furnace hummed again through the vents, still off rhythm. Every wrong note a reminder that someone else had been trying to make this house theirs. In the quiet, I heard a soft vibration, a phone buzzing, not mine. The sound came from downstairs. Laura answered it quickly, her voice softened in a way she had not softened toward me tonight. I closed my eyes, not in pain, in recognition. The truth does not shout, it whispers, in the wrong scent on a glass, in the way a child hesitates. In the silence between husband and wife where conversation used to live. I stood and walked to the window. Snow lined the driveway in thin layers untouched. My truck waited where I had left it, faithful, consistent, still mine. Inside, I could no longer say the same. I heard footsteps on the stairs, small, light. Our daughter peeked into the room. She did not speak. She simply looked at me, then at the bed, then back at me again. Her eyes held something she was too young to articulate. A question, a warning, a sadness. I told her to get some sleep. She nodded and disappeared down the hall. When her footsteps faded, I sat at the edge of the bed again. My hands rested on my knee. My breathing slowed. The house remained silent, waiting, watching. Homes do not change overnight. People do. And sometimes the house is the only one honest enough to tell you. I let the darkness settle around me. The furnace hummed off beat one more time. I listened to it like a man listening to a story he already knows the ending to, but is not ready to admit yet. Then I reached for the lamp and turned it off. The room fell into shadow, and somewhere below, the faint scent of sandalwood drifted up the stairs, confirming what the silence had been trying to tell me all along. The warmth was gone, and I was no longer sure this house wanted me back. The house was still dim when I walked downstairs the next morning, the kind of gray light that makes walls look colder than they are. The furnace hummed again with that same uneven pulse. It sounded almost like breathing that had gone out of rhythm. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me, then moved toward the kitchen. Laura was already dressed, hair done, jacket on. phone face down as usual. She greeted me quietly. Her voice was calm and clipped the way people speak when they have already mentally stepped out of the room. She poured herself coffee, lifted it to her lips, and the faint trace of that sandalwood scent passed by me again. It clung to her clothes in a way no new perfume should after only one day. I asked if she had an early meeting. She nodded without looking up and said work was unpredictable lately. She used the word unpredictable the way people use a shield, and then she left before I could say anything else. Her car pulled out of the driveway with a softness that felt practiced. When the door closed, I walked into the garage. The cold concrete floor steadied me. I opened the drawer where I kept old tech and tools and found the GPS module I had installed years ago. It was dusty and almost forgotten, like a piece of our marriage left in storage. I carried it inside, opened my laptop, and connected the device. The screen lit up with a map of the city and a trail of data points that had no reason to exist. A series of pins appeared in an area south of downtown, a new business complex with glass towers and manicured landscaping. The timestamps matched nights Laura said she was staying late at work. Her company was nowhere near that place. I stared at the screen until the numbers began to take shape as something heavier than suspicion. Truth grows slowly at first, then all at once. I closed the laptop and walked to her car in the driveway. The interior smelled different, a subtle blend of sandalwood and a cologne I did not recognize. On the passenger seat was a coffee sleeve from a cafe she never visited. I picked it up. There was a small scribble on the side. A single letter. T. It meant nothing on its own, yet it felt like a thread to something larger. Later in the afternoon, I checked our shared email. I had avoided it for weeks. It felt like opening a door to a room where something had died but no one had cleaned up yet. Inside the trash folder, I found a reservation confirmation from an Italian restaurant downtown. A table for 2 at 9 in the evening. The date matched the night she said she had a team meeting. The charge on our bank account confirmed only 2 meals. No group, no celebration. Just 2 plates on a table meant for quiet conversations and dim lights. I leaned back in the chair and rubbed my jaw. The house around me felt unchanged yet unfamiliar. I walked into the living room and noticed something subtle. The family photo from our trip to McCall had been moved slightly. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough for someone who remembered the exact angle it used to sit. I straightened it and felt an ache settle deeper in my chest. When school ended, I picked up our daughter. She climbed into the truck with her backpack hugged close to her body. She looked tired in a way children are not supposed to look. I asked about her day. She answered in short sentences, eyes fixed on the window. I asked about music class. She shrugged. I asked who she played with at recess. She gave me half a smile, then let it fade. On the way home, she mentioned a name, Tyler. She said it simply, like the name had weight, then she stopped talking altogether. I asked who Tyler was. She shook her head, quickly stared down at her hands, and pressed her lips together. The way a child does when they know a line they should not cross. Her silence told me more than any explanation could. That evening, Laura came home later than usual. She placed her bag on the counter and sat next to her phone. The screen lit up once with a name before she quickly flipped it over. I saw only the first letter. T. She said it was nothing and changed the subject before I could ask. The house fell quiet again. She sat on the couch. I sat in the recliner. The lamp cast a warm light across the room, but the air between us felt cold. She scrolled her phone with small, careful movements. Every time I looked at her, she looked away. She asked about dinner, about errands, about anything except the things that mattered. When she finally said she was going to bed, she stood up slowly. She paused as if waiting for me to speak. I did not. She climbed the stairs and her shadow moved along the wall like a person slipping into another life. I waited until the house settled. Then I opened my laptop again. The GPS logs, the emails, the receipts. Everything lined up with a precision that was almost cruel. Each detail was a quiet voice in a growing chorus. I closed the laptop, exhaled, and leaned back. The dining table felt cold under my hand. The furnace hummed again, the same wrong rhythm as the night before. A reminder that something had been altered without my knowledge. A car passed on the street outside. Its headlights moved across the blinds in narrow stripes. For a brief moment, the room lit up just enough for me to see Laura's phone left on the kitchen counter. It vibrated once. A soft glow pulsed against the stainless steel. A name appeared. Not fully, just enough. The same letter. T. The vibration stopped. The house went still, and everything inside me did the opposite. The last pulse of light from Laura's phone still lingered in my mind hours later. I carried it with me the next day like a quiet echo. It stayed beneath everything I did, beneath the weight of each breath, beneath the sound of the furnace running off rhythm again. By late afternoon, I was driving home earlier than usual, not because I wanted to, but because something in me needed to see the house, while the day still held a little light. I turned onto our street slower than normal and let the truck glide into the driveway. The air tasted like early evening, cold and metallic, and the sky was settling into that dull blue that comes before night. I walked around to the back door out of habit. The yard was still the kind of stillness that makes you hesitate before breaking it. When I pushed the door open, I expected silence. Instead, I heard my daughter's laugh, a bright sound, full and unguarded the way she used to laugh before weeks of hesitation began creeping into her voice. The sound lifted for a moment, then another voice joined it, a man's voice, low, steady, easing into the room like it belonged there. My hand paused on the doorknob. It tightened a fraction. That was the only reaction I allowed myself. Then I stepped inside. Warmth hit my face first. The smell of butter and batter filled the air, soft and sweet. The kitchen lights were on, casting a clean glow across the counters. My daughter stood on a chair at the island with a mixing bowl in front of her. Her cheeks were flushed. Her hair was tied back the way she liked it when she wanted to impress someone. Next to her stood a man I had never seen in my house. Navy shirt, sleeves rolled, confident posture. He leaned slightly toward her as she stirred, guiding her from just close enough to be familiar. He glanced at her bowl and spoke with a gentle approval in his voice. "Good job, kiddo." She turned toward him with a proud smile. She held up the spoon like she was waiting for him to confirm what she already hoped was true. For a second, neither of them noticed me. Then her eyes shifted, caught sight of me standing at the door, and everything in her face changed. Her smile collapsed halfway as if she had stepped into a different temperature. "Dad." The word slipped from her before she could stop it. Her shoulders stiffened. She looked at the man beside her, then back at me, unsure where she was supposed to stand in that moment. The man turned at a pace that told me he was not startled. He looked at me with a calm, practiced expression, then stepped forward as if introductions were routine. He extended his hand, steady and unbothered. "I am Tyler. I work with Laura." His voice carried the confidence of someone who believed he had earned this space. His handshake was warm, firm, and a second longer than necessary. My hand tightened around his out of instinct, only slightly, just enough to feel the bones without breaking the gesture. Then I let go. Laura stood near the sink. I had not seen her at first. She leaned there with her arms folded, her expression smooth, too smooth. For the smallest moment, something flickered across her face. A strain, a tightening at the jaw, then it vanished. She pushed her hair behind her ear and said he had stopped by to return a file. She said our daughter asked him to stay for pancakes. Her voice fell into a neat rhythm, one that sounded like it had been rehearsed. I walked farther into the kitchen. The air felt warmer around them, but colder near me. My daughter slid off the chair and clutched her notebook to her chest. She hesitated for a breath, then stepped toward Tyler first. She opened the notebook to a page filled with blue crayon strokes and held it up to him with tentative pride. "I made this today." He bent slightly to look at it. His voice softened with practiced warmth. "That is really nice. You are good at this." Only after hearing him say that did she turn toward me. She held the notebook up halfway as if unsure if I would want to see it. I forced a small smile. I told her it was great. She nodded quickly, then moved back toward Tyler's side without thinking. The shift was small, barely noticeable, but it caught me in the chest harder than I expected. I rested my hand on the counter, letting my fingers press against the cool surface. That tiny reaction was enough. A moment where control slipped just a hair. I steadied my breathing and scanned the room again. A small wooden frame sat near the stove. Pale wood, new, untouched by sun or time. Inside it was a picture I had never seen. Laura, my daughter, and Tyler standing close together at the fall fair. Her hand rested lightly on our daughter's back. Tyler leaned just enough to make the frame feel balanced. My daughter held cotton candy and smiled wide, the kind of smile I had not seen since coming home. The frame was positioned near the spot where I usually left my watch, as if something of mine had been lifted and replaced. I reached out and touched the corner of the frame. Not enough to move it, just enough to feel its edges. There was a fine layer of flour dust on the counter beneath it. It looked like it had been placed there in a hurry. Laura's gaze tightened when she saw me touch it. Her fingers tapped once on the counter before she pushed away and walked toward the fridge, giving herself something physical to focus on. Anything to avoid the weight of the moment. Tyler straightened the bowl in front of my daughter as if nothing was wrong. As if he had done this before, as if he believed he would be here again tomorrow. I stepped back and opened the drawer to grab a clean towel. My breath drew in slower than usual. My chest lifted with the weight of a reaction I refused to show. The towel felt rough against my palm. I folded it once and set it beside the sink. The skillet hissed softly. Steam curled upward and disappeared into the kitchen light. My daughter washed her hands at the sink, standing closer to Laura than to me. She hummed a quiet tune under her breath, the kind she used to sing when she felt safe. Tyler leaned against the counter, arms relaxed, watching them with an ease that did not belong to a visitor. His posture said he had been here long enough to learn the room. A faint smile touched his mouth. Not a challenge, not an apology, just a quiet confidence. I looked at him. He held the gaze comfortably, the way a man does when he believes he has already won something. I turned away before the moment could stretch too far. Not because I was avoiding him, because I wanted my next words, whenever they came, to land clean and quiet. My daughter's laughter faded into a softer sound. The faucet squeaked when she shut it off. The furnace clicked on again, the same wrong rhythm as before, shaking faintly through the vents. I stood there with my hand on the back of a chair, watching my shadow stretch long across the floor. And I let the silence settle in every space they had filled. The truth was no longer forming. It had arrived. The house stayed warm after they all went upstairs, but the warmth felt borrowed. I stood alone in the kitchen with only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the stove cooling down. The framed photo near the counter held its place like a quiet witness. I let my fingertips rest on the wood for a moment, then turned away and walked down the hall without making a sound. The office door clicked shut behind me. Not loud, just final. I opened the laptop and the glow spilled across the desk, sharpening the edges of everything around it. My hands moved on their own, steady and methodical, the way they moved during long nights on deployment when paperwork meant precision and precision meant survival. I pulled up our joint accounts and let the pages load. Transactions lined the screen in neat rows, clean numbers that did not lie. 3 withdrawals stood out, large, spaced out, routed to an unfamiliar account. No notes, no labels. Money disappearing in silence. My pulse stayed even. The truth had already begun writing itself. I saved the screenshots one by one. The room felt colder when I leaned back. I took out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in months. A friend from my service days. A military lawyer who had spent years cleaning up lives after they cracked. I pressed the call button and listened to the line ring. He answered with a steady voice, the kind of tone built from long nights in legal offices and barracks. I told him I needed advice. I did not explain everything. I did not need to. He listened for a few seconds before speaking. Do not talk in emotion. From now on, every word you say is evidence. He paused, letting the weight settle, then added one more line. Move carefully. Move quietly. The call ended without good nights or small talk. We understood each other better in silence anyway. I set the phone down and turned to the GPS logs again. This time I opened the recent route history and captured every stop that matched Laura's late nights. Each pin on the map glowed with cold clarity. Same complex south of downtown, same pattern, same lies. The house creaked above me. Someone shifting in bed. I stayed still until the sound faded. Then I opened the cabinet where I used to keep home repair tools. The wireless door camera sat in the back, still in its old box. Laura had asked me to remove the rear camera last year, said it was unnecessary. I nodded back then because trust was easier than suspicion. Tonight I unboxed it, plugged it into the laptop, and reset the system. The soft green light blinked once, steady and quiet. I slipped out through the garage and moved along the siding toward the rear corner of the house. The night air pressed cold against my skin. The neighborhood slept in that heavy silence only suburbs know after 10 p.m. I mounted the camera under the eave, tightened the screws with slow, clean motions, and tested the feed. Clear, wide, silent. On my way back inside, the garage door closed behind me with a low groan. I sat in the truck for a moment without turning on the engine. The ventilation unit above the garage kicked on, blowing a low stream of air that made the space hum. It was a steady sound, grounding in a way the furnace no longer was. I rested my hands on the steering wheel. They did not tremble. They did not clench. They simply rested. Something had shifted inside me since the moment I saw Tyler in my kitchen. A line had been crossed. Not with noise, not with anger, with certainty. I breathed once, slow and deep, then went back into the house. In the office again, I opened the folder of documents we kept in the lower drawer. Mortgage agreements, loan papers, insurance records, all the pieces of a life built over years. I scanned them and saved digital copies, organizing them into quiet folders on a drive no one else used. I gathered the email confirmations from the restaurant and placed them beside the GPS screenshots. I opened the school schedule for my daughter. I saved everything. Not because I planned to use it, but because knowledge is leverage and leverage is protection. At the edge of the desk, my wedding ring caught the light from the screen. A faint reflection flickered on the metal, then disappeared when I shifted my hand. I watched it for a moment. Not the ring itself, the absence of meaning behind it now. A man does not shout when he understands what the truth is doing. He listens. I went further. I opened the public records database and typed Tyler's name. The results loaded slowly, line by line. His position at the company, his management history, his office location matching the same complex from the GPS. It painted a clean picture, almost too clean. Outside, a car passed by the house, casting headlights across the blinds in a moving stripe of pale blue. The room dimmed again after it left. The quiet deepened. I kept reading until the last piece of his profile confirmed he had been in Boise for only 8 months. Just enough time to step into someone else's home if the door was left cracked open. The clock on the wall read past midnight. I closed the files, shut the laptop, and rested my hands on the desk. My breath felt steady, my mind clearer than it had been in days. I walked out into the garage again, needing the open air more than the warmth of the house. The cold hit me with a clarity I welcomed. I sat on the step near the storage shelves and listened to the hum of the ventilation. No voices, no laughter, no lies. I closed my eyes. I had walked out of battles before. I had seen men break and build themselves again. I knew the shift from husband to investigator because it had a distinct calm to it, a steel calm, a clarity born not from rage but from necessity. I was not planning revenge, I was collecting truth, and truth is colder than anger. It moves slower, it hits harder. I opened my eyes and looked at the dark frame of the doorway leading back into my home. The house seemed still, like it was holding its breath. I stood up, pressed my hand lightly against the door frame, and let the cold sink into my skin. The night settled around me in a heavy quiet. A quiet thick enough to feel the next steps would not be loud. I turned off the garage light, leaving only the faint outline of the house behind me, and let the darkness shape itself around the truth I now carried. The garage was dark when I stepped out, but the darkness felt cleaner than the light inside the house. Cold air seeped in through the crack under the door, carrying the faint scent of winter dust and dry leaves. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle into my bones. It was the kind of silence that tells you something has ended even if no one has said the words yet. I walked to the truck and pulled the door open. The hinges gave a soft groan. I sat behind the wheel and rested my hands on it without turning the engine on. My wedding ring touched the leather, a quiet tap that echoed in the small cab. I watched the house through the windshield. The kitchen light glowed behind the curtains, warm and steady, as if nothing had happened. As if the truth had not shifted the ground beneath it. I turned the key and drove. The street spread out ahead of me, empty and pale under the street lamps. Boise at night has a softness to it, a hush that makes the city feel smaller. I followed the road without choosing a direction until the skyline began to rise and the foothills appeared in the distance. The climb toward Capitol View was slow and steady. The engine hummed like a steady breath. At the top I parked and stepped out. The wind hit my face, sharp, clean. The city stretched below in a wide basin of soft amber lights. Houses lined up like quiet promises. Roads winding through them like veins. From up there, everything looked manageable. Even the parts of my life that had begun slipping out of my hands. I leaned on the hood of the truck and closed my eyes for a moment. The cold metal beneath my palms felt honest. Honest in a way people sometimes fail to be. I thought of the early years. The cramped apartment with the beige carpet that never quite matched the walls. The second-hand table we bought on a loan because we wanted a place to eat that felt like ours. The nights when Laura would laugh at the way I installed the heating unit, insisting I had tightened the bolts too much. The mornings when we did not rush. Life had been slower then, simpler, more aligned with breath than expectation. The wind picked up, brushing past my ears with a low hum. It pulled me forward into the next memory whether I wanted it or not. The long absences, the weeks in different time zones, the calls cut short by meetings or by the exhaustion in our voices. The way she used to wait for me at the door, then later waited in the kitchen, then later waited somewhere in the house, then finally waited without expectation. At some point, waiting had become a burden rather than a gesture. I felt a tightness in my chest. Not from betrayal, from recognition. Distance grows quietly. You don't notice it until you turn around and see how far you have drifted. I exhaled slowly. Somewhere inside me, a truth shifted. Part of what had happened was my doing, my devotion to work, my discipline, my belief that duty could carry the weight of presence. I had left spaces empty long enough for someone else to fill them. But acknowledgement is not justification, and silence is not consent. Her choices were still hers, her lies were still deliberate. I opened my eyes. The city stretched below, same as before, only I had changed. I stood there until the cold settled into my shoulders. Then I walked back to the truck and opened the door. The cabin light flicked on and cast a pale glow over the seat. My daughter's small jacket lay folded in the back. Purple buttons, a tiny stain of orange marker near the pocket. I stared at it longer than I meant to. She had not chosen any of this. She had not chosen the distance, or the return, or the man standing in our kitchen. I pressed my fingers lightly against the steering wheel and felt my breathing steady again. The next steps were no longer about saving a marriage. They were about protecting a child and protecting the part of myself that refused to be bent by deceit. I drove back down the hill. The city grew larger as I descended. Streetlights blurred slightly in the corner of my eyes. The hum of the tires on the asphalt kept a slow rhythm. When I turned into our neighborhood, most of the houses were already dark. Porch lights off, curtains closed, people asleep inside lives that still made sense to them. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a few seconds. The house looked quiet. No shadows moving behind the curtains. No sound leaking from the vents, just the steady glow of the upstairs hallway light. I stepped inside and let the door close behind me with a soft click. The smell of the house felt muted, familiar but distant, like remembering a scent rather than breathing it. Upstairs, my daughter's room door was slightly open. I walked toward it slowly. Each step felt measured, as if the floor might change beneath me if I moved too fast. She lay in bed, curled into her blanket, one arm tucked under her cheek. Her breath came slow and even, the kind of breath children have when they feel safe. A stuffed animal rested beside her, its fur worn from years of being carried and held. I knelt beside the bed and watched her for a long moment. Her eyelashes trembled slightly with each breath. A strand of hair fell across her forehead. I brushed it back gently. Her face softened even further in sleep. A quiet peace. A peace I wanted to keep untouched. I whispered her name, barely letting the sound leave my throat. She did not wake. She turned slightly toward the warmth of my hand, and for a second the ache in my chest deepened, then steadied itself. This was the center of everything. Not the betrayal, not the broken vows, not the man in my kitchen. Her. I stood slowly, careful not to wake her. I stepped back into the hallway and pulled the door to a narrow gap. The faint hallway light spilled across the carpet, warm and thin. The house was silent again, but the silence felt different now. Not empty, not defeated. Purpose has a sound. It is quiet, but it fills every corner it needs to. I walked toward the stairs, placing my hand lightly on the railing. My fingers tightened just once before releasing. The air around me felt colder, clearer, the kind of cold that sharpens rather than numbs. Downstairs, the kitchen light flickered once, as if responding to the shift inside me. I stopped at the bottom step. The night held its breath, and I knew the next chapter of this would not be about anger. It would be about ending something with dignity before it destroyed anything more. The morning arrived without warmth. I woke before the alarm and lay still in the half-light, listening to the quiet spaces of the house. Each room felt distant, as if the walls had shifted an inch overnight. When I dressed, the fabric of my shirt felt heavier than usual, the kind of weight that settles on you when the truth is no longer a question but a process. I went downstairs and poured a glass of water. The sound of it hitting the cup was sharper than it should have been. Outside, the cold held on to the pavement. I walked to the truck and let the engine warm. My breath fogged the window as I sat there watching the neighborhood wake in smooth motions. A porch light flicked on across the street. A garage door groaned open a few houses down. It all felt detached from the direction my day was heading. At the courthouse, the glass doors reflected the morning sky in pale streaks. Inside, the air was too clean and too still. The floors shone under the overhead lights. People moved through security with slow resignation. I walked down the hall toward the Ada County hearing rooms with my lawyer beside me. His steps were even and restrained. He did not speak. He did not need to. The silence was part of the preparation. The courtroom door opened with a muted thud. The room was bright, washed in a flat white light that gave no comfort. The judge sat at the bench still and composed. Papers lay stacked in quiet layers on his desk. He adjusted his glasses once, then motioned for the hearing to begin. Laura sat at the opposite table. Her posture was carefully arranged. Back straight, hands folded, eyes forward. Tyler sat a few feet behind her, his shoulders tense beneath a pressed shirt. He looked like he had dressed for confidence but had lost some of it on the way in. The clerk read the case details. The sound of her voice felt like a slow blade cutting through the room. When the judge nodded, Laura's attorney stood and began speaking. His voice was measured, polished. He spoke of stress. He spoke of strain. He spoke of my long absences and the toll of training cycles. His tone suggested instability without saying the word. My lawyer rose and handed over a folder. The judge opened it. Pages shifted softly. My military evaluation sat on top. The judge scanned the document for a moment. His eyes steadied. My lawyer said only that the record spoke for itself. The judge nodded once. The air in the room shifted almost imperceptibly. Then came the financial records, screenshots, bank statements, 3 withdrawals marked with the quiet precision of numbers that do not lie. My lawyer laid them out one by one. He did not raise his voice. He did not color the facts. He simply arranged them like stones across a riverbed. The judge leaned back slightly as he read. Laura's fingers tightened around the fabric of her sleeve. A small tremor, barely visible, but it was there. Tyler sat straighter but did not meet my eyes. More documents followed. Dining receipts with dates that contradicted work events. GPS logs that mapped the same office complex again and again. Each detail landed with the soft finality of something undeniable. My lawyer spoke sparingly, allowing the trail to build its own shape. Then the discussion turned to the audio. My lawyer explained its source. A voice note recovered from the tablet of a child. Not solicited, not planted, not designed to accuse. The judge listened carefully. He asked one question. My lawyer answered with the same calm he had carried all morning. The judge agreed to hear a brief portion, not as evidence, as context. The playback lasted only a few seconds. The room held its breath. A man's voice came through low and controlled. The words carried a weight they should not have carried when spoken to a child. A warning disguised as guidance. A tone meant to shape a boundary where it did not belong. When the sound ended, the judge paused. He looked at Laura first, then at Tyler. His expression did not change, but the silence he allowed after the clip told its own story. He said the court would not treat the audio as proof, but he could not dismiss the concerns it raised about the environment surrounding the child. Laura shifted in her seat. Her confidence, once arranged with careful precision, loosened at the edges. She stared at the table as if the grain of the wood held answers she needed. My lawyer presented the final folder. School schedules, cooperative agreements, notes from teachers, nothing dramatic, nothing sharp, just a trail of consistency showing where stability had been and where it had not. The judge took a moment. He rested his hands on the bench and surveyed the room. He made his decision without raising his voice. He said that until the investigation into finances and relationships was concluded, temporary custody would be assigned to me. He stated it plainly, as if it were a matter of whether rather than the course of a family's life. Laura closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, they were different, less certain, less shielded. Tyler looked toward the floor. The clerk recorded the ruling. Papers rustled, chairs shifted. The room began to uncoil from its tension. My lawyer placed a hand briefly on my shoulder before walking toward the door. It was the kind of gesture men use when words feel unnecessary. I gathered my documents and stepped into the hallway. The air felt lighter but colder. The fluorescent lights hummed above me. People passed in clusters, their conversations blending into a soft, distant murmur. Tyler stood near the far wall. One shoulder leaned back as if he needed support. His jaw moved, once tightening, then settling again. His eyes found mine. There was no confidence in them now, only the look of a man who realized the ground beneath him had begun to shift. He held my gaze for a moment longer, searching for something he could not name. I walked past him without speaking. The echo of my footsteps followed me down the hallway. By the time I reached the door to the outside, the cold air was waiting. I stepped into it and let it settle across my skin. The sky above was washed pale, a thin blue stretched over the city. The truth had begun to speak, not with noise, but with the steady accumulation of facts. And facts, once assembled, rarely step backward. The morning after the hearing, the house felt different before I even opened my eyes. The heat kicked on in a slow, steady breath, and the walls held a kind of quiet that was not empty, only waiting. I walked through the hallway with the early blue light brushing over the family pictures. I let my eyes pass over them without reaching for any memory. Some truths no longer had to be revisited to be understood. By noon, my attorney called. His voice carried the calm tone of someone who had already read the outcome between the lines. The company had opened a full internal review on Tyler and the fund he supervised. It happened quietly, the way corporate matters usually move in Idaho, through closed office doors and short emails from human resources. Nothing from the audio could be used against him directly, but the numbers, once examined, did not sit straight. They had their own voice, and it traveled faster than any whisper. 2 days later, a co-worker from the downtown district told me he had seen Tyler leaving the building with a cardboard box. No confrontation, no raised voices, just a man being escorted to the parking lot, while the automatic doors opened and closed behind him like a quiet curtain. He walked fast, head down, as if the air had become too heavy around him. Laura moved out that same week. She chose the afternoon when our daughter was at school and I was at work. When I returned, the house breathed a little wider, as if it had been holding its breath for too long. A few drawers were left open. A picture frame was gone from the living room shelf. Her key rested on the kitchen counter beside a note saying she would pick our daughter up Saturday. The handwriting was steady, but the paper felt tense under my hand. Our daughter stayed with me most nights. She did not ask for an explanation. She simply adjusted as children do when the ground shifts beneath them. One evening, she left a drawing on my desk. 3 figures stood under a sun. The one in the middle was faint, almost erased. I looked at it for a long time, wondering whether she meant to draw it that way or whether her hand had hesitated. She did not mention it, and I did not ask. Some truths in a house do not need words to be spoken aloud. When Laura came to pick her up that Saturday, she stood by the porch steps. The wind moved her hair across her face. Our daughter ran toward her with a small smile, and Laura bent down, holding her a second longer than usual. When she looked at me, there was something faint in her eyes, almost like recognition, almost like regret. We exchanged a simple greeting. Not warm, not cold. Just a line drawn carefully in the air between two people who once shared everything. I saw her again days later at the grocery store on Federal Way. She was choosing apples, her posture smaller than I remembered. She noticed me after a moment and offered a quiet nod. I returned it. No words followed. She turned back to her cart and I walked on. It felt like passing someone on a trail after a long winter. Familiar but belonging to a distance that could no longer close. Near the end of the month, I found Tyler's business card tucked behind an old cookbook while cleaning the kitchen. The title printed under his name was no longer valid. The card had a small crease in it, as if someone had pressed it too hard once. I held it a moment, then dropped it in the trash with a soft sound. It settled among the wrappers and receipts without ceremony, the way some endings do. Nights grew quieter. After our daughter went to bed, I sometimes stood near the window and watched the cars slide along the road below. Their headlights painted brief lines across the pavement before fading. The house no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like a place rebuilding its balance. I kept the routine steady. Dinner at 6, stories before bed. The small anchors that tell a child the world is still steady even when the adults are not. One night I was closing the blinds when I noticed the porch light flicker against the frost gathering on the railing. The yard was still. The sky held a muted gray. I rested my hand on the back of the couch and let the quiet settle around me. It was not forgiveness and not victory. It was simply the space that remained after truth had taken its place. I turned off the lamp and stood for a moment in the dim glow from the street. The silence in the room did not feel heavy anymore. It felt honest, like the pause between two breaths when the world holds steady, waiting for whatever comes next. The silence I carried from that winter did not leave all at once. It thinned the way frost does, a little at a time, until one morning I noticed it had stopped pressing on my chest. The porch light was still on when I stepped outside, and the air felt cool but not cruel. The sky was pale blue, the kind that makes you think of clean sheets and fresh starts. Somewhere down the street, a lawn sprinkler clicked on, steady as a heartbeat. A year passed like that, quietly. Not with a date circled on a calendar, but with small repairs and small decisions that added up to a life I could stand in again. I replaced the fence that had leaned too long under snow and wind. I sanded the porch steps and painted them the same soft gray they used to be before everything went sideways. In the backyard, I planted 3 apple saplings along the property line. Thin trunks, young branches, buds that looked like they were learning how to trust the sun. In early spring, they were still bare. By late April, there was a faint green on each tip, a soft promise that did not ask to be believed, only to be witnessed. Inside the house no longer felt like a place I was borrowing. It felt like a place I was rebuilding. I cleared the garage the way a man clears his head. I sorted old gear into 2 piles, things that still mattered and things that belonged to another season. One Saturday, I drove a load of boxes to a storage unit on the edge of town. The clerk slid a key across the counter and nodded like he had seen this kind of reshuffling before. I stacked the boxes on metal shelves, sealed the door, and took a slow breath in the cool darkness of the unit. It was not a dramatic moment. It was a practical one. That mattered more. Later that month, I updated the homeowner's insurance and removed Laura's name from the policy. The agent did not ask questions. She only confirmed the address and the coverage limits, then sent the new documents to my email. There was something clean about that kind of closure. Not emotional, administrative. A line drawn in ink instead of tears. Our daughter changed in ways I did not notice until I looked back. She slept through the night more often. Her appetite returned. The tightness around her shoulders loosened like a knot slowly untied by steady hands. One evening she left a drawing on the kitchen table right where I set my coffee each morning. Two figures under a wide blue sky. One taller, one smaller, standing close, no one else in the frame. She had colored the grass bright green and the sun yellow enough to feel warm. I picked it up and ran a thumb along the edge. "You did this today?" She nodded without looking up from her cereal. "Do you like it?" I did. The words sat heavy in my throat for a moment. "Yeah, sweetheart, I like it a lot." She smiled. Not big, not performative, just a small, honest smile that said she meant what she was feeling. Laura still texted from time to time. Simple questions. Is she still taking piano? Does she like the new teacher? How is she sleeping? I answered with short updates and occasional photos of school projects. The messages never turned into arguments or apologies. They stayed factual, civil, like two adults protecting a child from the rough edges of their history. Any anger I had once carried had melted months earlier the way snow disappears from a shaded yard once the sun finally stays. I did not forgive to make her feel better. I forgave because carrying bitterness felt like carrying a weight that did not belong to my daughter's future. In late spring, I ran into Laura outside a small diner near downtown, the kind with sun-faded booths and coffee that tastes like it has been doing its job for decades. She was walking out with a paper bag in her hand. Her face looked quieter than I remembered. Not broken, just older around the eyes. She asked how our daughter was doing. I told her she was good, that she had a school play coming up, that she was still stubborn about piano lessons. Laura nodded. A soft smile moved across her mouth for a second. Her eyes lingered past me as if she was looking at a door that used to be open. "I am glad she is doing well." Her voice was light, but there was a strain under it, a kind of regret that did not ask for comfort. I nodded once. That was all either of us needed. Tyler was already gone from Idaho by then. His name stopped coming up. His shadow moved on to wherever shadows go when a truth catches up to them. I did not follow it. I did not need to. The space he left behind was empty in the way a cleared field is empty, ready for something else to grow. On a warm Saturday in May, my daughter and I worked in the yard together. She wore my old work gloves, the fingers too long for her hands. She knelt by the nearest apple tree, brushing aside a leaf to inspect a small cluster of buds. Is it really going to make apples someday? I crouched beside her. The dirt smelled wet and alive. Yeah, if we keep taking care of it, it will. She considered that for a moment, then pressed her palm gently against the thin trunk. So it just needs time. That line landed softly and stayed. She had not meant it as anything bigger. But I heard it anyway. I looked at her face, calm and serious in the sunlight, and felt something settle inside me. Time and care and the right kind of quiet. That evening I cooked dinner while she colored at the table. The kitchen window was open. A breeze moved the curtains in slow waves. Outside, kids down the block were riding bikes, their laughter singing and fading in the warm air. The air conditioner hummed steady, not loud enough to notice until it stopped. The house held a gentle rhythm now. Nothing forced, nothing rehearsed. After dinner, she washed her plate without being asked, then went upstairs and left her backpack by the door the way she used to. I watched her climb the steps light and unburdened and realized that the most important kind of justice is not what you take back. It is what you manage to keep intact. Later, I stepped onto the porch with a mug of tea. The sky was turning amber, then soft gray, then a deeper blue. Wind moved through the pine tree at the corner of our yard, steady and calm. The new fence stood straight. The apple saplings swayed lightly, their leaves catching the last of the sun. I thought about everything that had brought me here. The long absence, the shock in my kitchen, the quiet work of gathering facts. The courtroom with its white light and cold air. The way consequences arrived without my pushing them. I did not feel proud of the outcome. I felt relieved by the honesty of it. I had walked through it without losing who I was, without letting bitterness become a second betrayal. I finished the tea and listened to the evening settle. A car rolled past, tires whispering on the street. A bird called once from the maple tree and went quiet again. The porch boards were warm under my feet. I went back inside and left the porch light on, not to keep anything away, but because the house no longer needed to hide. I closed the door softly behind me. The latch turned with a small, sure click. In the living room, the drawing of two figures under a blue sky rested on the table, catching the last strip of light through the window. The air conditioner hummed. The house breathed steady. Outside, the apple trees moved gently in the dark, and for the first time in a long while, the quiet I lived in felt like peace, not punishment. I stood there a moment longer, then turned toward the hallway, letting the night fall behind me like a coat I did not need anymore.